oh, and it is, I forgot to remind you about that, Diane. It is referring to, like I said, Jews who didn't agree with Jesus, and it's Jesus supposedly speaking here. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. This is saying that the Jews are children of the devil, okay? Again, if it's an intra-Jewish conversation, you can see, as we all know from social media, things can get very heated, even with people who are from the same group, but this has been transposed, and the entire, anybody who identifies themselves as a Jew is now seen as a child of Satan. Jews are also supposedly said in the book of Matthew that they wanted to free Barabbas, they wanted Jesus to be crucified, and they yelled out, "Let his blood be on us and our children," which of course is a statement that invites persecution, which happened, as you saw in the well picture, a whole lot. So this is a very negative portrayal of Jews. These are the ones who want to kill Christian children and use their blood in matzahs. This is all the bad stuff that came out through Christianity throughout the ages. And the best example of the taboo Jew is something we may be very familiar with. It's in the book Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, which was written in 1838. And this is the character of Fagin. And I put in the slide, not this, because this is from the musical Oliver, and it was so good. Anyone who has ever seen the musical Oliver, it's amazing. They took most of the negative characteristics of Fagin, who was that taboo Jew in the book. They put it on to Bill Sikes, who was incredibly creepy. And it just shows, I was a young kid when I first saw this. I forget when it came out. I was 9 or 10 years old. And I thought Fagin was the best character ever. I wasn't, I thought he was like a fun Jewish grandfather. So I don't think that the musical has any problems to it. They sort of made him rascally and adorable. And a lot of people think that's how the book treats it. But old movies and the book itself, nah, shows something completely different. And somehow now I can't seem to click on this. I don't know why. Let me go back here, and I apologize. Let me see what I can do. I think I may just put it in a new share and try this again. Okay, one participant can share at a time. Let me go back to I may have to go back into this a bit. Let me go and see if this helps and see if I can click. There we go. Okay, it got kludged. Who knows why? Okay, so this is, you notice this depiction, this picture, this was actually a depiction, an illustration from the real Oliver Twist. Notice the red hair. This is supposed to be the mark of Judas. It goes way back into medieval times, something about Jewish bloodlust. Notice the features, notice the evil look. This is the image that people read and saw when they read Oliver Twist. So I wanted to just read a couple of these quotes. And it's talking about, as we see him, he's cooking. He has his group of boys that he intends, that his gang, basically, he's corrupting these kids and teaching them how to steal. In a frying pan, some sausages were cooking, and standing over them was a very old shriveled Jew whose villainous looking and repulsive face was obscured by a quantity of matted red hair. In short, and he's talking about Oliver and how he is going to corrupt Oliver. In short, the wily old Jew had the boy in his toils, having prepared his mind by solitude and gloom to prefer any society to the companionship of his own sad thoughts in such a dreary place. He was now slowly instilling into his soul the poison, which he hoped would blacken it and change its hue forever. So he is turning this innocent boy into sort of a satanic little devil, okay? And that's the image of Oliver Twist. There is nothing good about Fagin in reading Oliver Twist. He is a horrible, horrible, horrible character. He is like Shylock without even the softening graces of Shylock, okay? If you cut me, do I not bleed? This one does not bleed. This one is worse. And he is just, the only thing that he does not do is kill, but he gets Bill Sikes to kill basically for him because he is so cowardly. That's the other piece of this. So that's nasty. And we are going to see some pieces of the taboo Jew popping up here and there, but it's never as bad, in my view, as this kind of awful, awful villain that Fagin presents, that Dickens presents in Fagin. Something more cheerful, the beautiful Jewess. And we have here 3 examples of this. Notice how similar they look, but these are all different depictions. This is Queen Esther. It's a painting done in the 19th century. And notice how gorgeous she looks. I mean, this is a beautiful, beautiful woman. She's exotic. She is Oriental, or in the sense of Orientalism, that women from other places are exotic and beautiful and much more desirable than the girl next door. And so that comes into play. And so this is one of the origins of the beautiful Jewess. Depictions of biblical heroines like Esther, like Ruth, like Judith, are usually incredibly gorgeous. So what they've done is they've taken their sexualized attitude towards this exotic other and they've placed it onto these biblical women. So there's a kind of an elevation out of the Jew into almost its own category. The Jewess almost becomes its own category away from male Jews. This is a painting of a Jew, a Jewess, I should say, in the Middle East. And again, notice the similarity of facial features, notice the similarity of the dark hair, how the hair is depicted. This is supposed to have been painted from real life. Not sure about that, but this is supposed to be a contemporary image. And finally, we have Rebecca Gratz, who is very famous in Philadelphia. She's started educational institutions. She was a famous beauty. She never married. Anybody who's familiar with, there's a Gratz High School, Gratz College, this all comes out of the same family. And notice how similar they all are. So there is some kind of an image of a Jewess. Now, the Jewess is supposed to be morally superior. This goes all the way back to Shylock and Jessica, where Shylock in A Merchant of Venice was this evil, Jewish, well, sort of evil, angry Jewish moneylender who wanted his pound of flesh. He was angry at the way he was treated. Jessica, his daughter, fell in love with a Christian, eventually fled with him, converted to Christianity. And that's how and she was beautiful. And that's how Jewesses were conceived, as these beautiful, emotional, purer kinds of people who were much more able to convert to Christianity and the true faith than the Jewish man who was considered to be a little bit too Shylockian to influence. So the best example of this is Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. This is written a little before the Victorian era, but it keeps those same tropes of the beautiful Jewess. We're going to see more of that in some of the other novels. And here's an illustration of the time. Rebecca is the beautiful Jewess, and there she is on the turret of Torquilstone trying to save Ivanhoe and his Christian blonde-haired beloved, I'm sure. And notice how beautiful she is. Here she is in a movie done in the 1950s. And yes, Elizabeth Taylor is Rebecca, which is very interesting because she did end up converting to Judaism to marry Eddie Fisher. I don't think it was here yet, but how interesting that our beautiful Jewess in the film becomes a beautiful Jewess in real life. Okay, so we also have the parvenu Jew. And actually, this is kind of one of my favorite images because really nouveau riche shows up in almost, it shows up with almost any minority in any culture, right? And it's the idea that when people start getting money, moving up in class as the Jews were doing throughout the 19th century, moving to middle class and then upper class. You have all of the mistakes of the nouveau riche. They were trying to be more British than British in this case. So they overdressed, they over articulated their words, they put too much emphasis on money. And you can see these stereotypes of the nouveau riche, even in the United States, not just about Jews, but about the Irish Catholics, about African Americans. Who did they think they are? You know, look at them, they're trying to be like us, but they're so over the top, it's embarrassing. You can see them coming a mile away. So, you know, nouveau riche people do that. They do overcompensate. They do try a little harder. I'm not saying that the stereotype is true in every respect. It's a little kernel of truth, completely exaggerated. So what's the origins of doing better? They were entering the middle class. They were becoming wealthy, and they were expecting to enter.
Carol, can you check your internet connection? We're having a little bit of a hiccup with hearing you.
Used a hotspot before, so I had to figure out how to do that. And here I am. All right, back to screen sharing.
Okay,
well, you know what?
This is a good. Highlight you again.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me do that. Let's see. Forgot how to do that. Spotlight for everyone. There we go.
Sorry about that. Hopefully this will take care of the problem.
Yes.
Okay. Up, host disabled participant.
Oh, you know what? I need to probably make you a host again. So,
yeah,
because you aren't. Let's see now. There you go. Make co-host. There we go.
Cool.
Now,
nope.
It's
still coming up.
Try it.
There I am.
Can you try it again?
There I am.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fine now.
It just takes a sec.
So this is like the nightmare for any teacher, because it's like, oh my God, I won't be able to do it. I won't be able to do everything I wanted to do. You guys are probably going, thank God. All right, here we are. And I'm gonna take that down to me. I'm gonna.
This is so interesting that we don't care. That's what.
Oh, that's so sweet. But yeah, okay. So the images of the parvenu Jew, like I said, it's reality. It's also the fact that Jews were going in specifically because if you start out money lending, you're going to go into the stock market, you're going to go into finance. And for the aristocrats who made their money off of land and thought that anything else, land ownership, was less than. So like if you own a factory, well, that's disgusting, right? But if you make your money just on financing, there's something even wrong with that, right? There's something there's something always wrong with making money on the stock market. Now, maybe they were right. These days, I have to wonder. But there is that idea that if you make your fortune in finance, you are shady by definition. If you make your fortune by manufacturing, you're uncouth. And if you have lots and lots of acres and have, have all your people, tug their forelock at you as it used to be and bow and scrape, then your wealth is kosher, as it were. So these folks are an example of this. And I know it's too small to be able to read, but clearly, as you see, they're dressed to the nines. And what it says in a Yiddish kind of an accent is this: "What a lovely diamond. Where did you get it?" This is the gentleman who's asking. And this is a diamond stick pin. Now, what you have to know is diamond stick pins, or stick pins in general, this is a shorthand for someone who's a gambler, or shorthand for someone who may have to flee. That is, if you have the jewelry, if you have the gem on you, then you can always run if you need to run from authorities, or you can always throw down in a gambling house. And you can always have that ready cash right in your tie. So the diamond stick pin is kind of a, or jewels, are kind of a shorthand. Portable wealth. Well, who needs portable wealth? People who aren't landed, people who aren't okay in British society. And so his response is, I got a lot of money to put up a stone in memory of a friend. That's the stone. So again, here's a guy who takes money for a friend and he turns it into profit for himself. So that's the shadiness. Now, this lovely beach beauty is, it says here, a kosher mermaid. And this is actually not English. I was looking for something and I just couldn't find it on Facebook images, but not Facebook, Google Images. But this is the kind of way that Jewish women were depicted: incredibly obese, not real attractive in a bathing suit, and often, notice she's wearing earrings. They're always loaded down with jewelry for the same reasons, ostensibly, as the men were. A, for ostentation, not realizing that this is uncouth, but B, because then they have this ready cash they can move with. Now, the best known work on this kind of parvenu Jew is The Way We Live Now, which I'll get back to, which was written by Anthony Trollope in 1875. And by this point, Jews were really moving up in the economy of Great Britain and really doing quite well. Now, at the same time, there was a huge influx of Jews from Eastern Europe. So you had poor Jews and rich Jews and middle-class Jews all coexisting at that juncture. Okay, the too good to be true Jew. This is seen in a couple of places, and I'm going to talk about that first. And I was trying to find a Jew with a halo, but trust me, I'm a rabbi. I thought he was kind of cute. I'm also a rabbi, so I kind of like that. So the idea of a perfect Jew versus the villainous Jew. So one of the most famous is Dickens. And Dickens, of course, wrote Fagin, and he was not helping the Jewish community in any way by doing this. So he wrote, Eliza Davis, who was this woman on the left, is a Jewish woman, clearly in the upper class financially. And she writes this: it has been said that Charles Dickens, the large-hearted, whose works plead so eloquently and so nobly for the oppressed of his country, and who may now justly claim credit as the fruits of his labor, the many changes for the amelioration of the condition of the poor now at work. So of course, Charles Dickens, I'll interrupt myself, Charles Dickens was known for writing about the terrible working conditions of the impoverished classes in 19th century Britain. And his novels, more than some of the nonfiction efforts along these lines, really raised people's consciousness of, you know, how terrible it was, especially in the factories, in the cities, this kind of thing. But she continues, he's done so much for the poor, but he has also encouraged a vile prejudice against the despised Hebrew. So Dickens decides she was an important person in society, and the Jews were sort of making it. So by 1864, he wrote his answer to Fagin, and that was Mr. Rhea, of our mutual friend. Mr. Rhea, it may have come from the idea of Re'eh in Hebrew, which does actually mean friend, Mr. Friend, okay? And he is, in this story, not the money lender, but he is the saintly employee of the money lender in this story called Fascination Fledgeby. I have to say, Dickens never does anything without an enormous ham hand. I mean, his characters are not subtle for the most part. And he has all, this is a Christian, a sort of regular British person. He has all the characteristics of a Jewish moneylender. This guy who works for him is maybe the most annoying Jewish character ever written. I think I prefer Fagin. He is, notice his humble demeanor. This is actually how he is written. He appears, this is Dickens himself describing him. He appears in an ancient coat, long of skirt and wide of pocket, a venerable man, bald and shining at the top of his head, with long gray hair flowing down at the sides and mingling with his beard. A man who, with a graceful Eastern action of homage, bent his head and stretched his hands with the palms downward, as if to deprecate the wrath of a superior. And somebody who is writing about this, analyzing this, says this: Ria's grotesquely virtuous behavior, as well as his appearance, smack of the artificial. He is ineffably saintly, consistently humble, merciful, generous, gentle, and forgiving, and just the most boring character you ever want to meet. I mean, really, just awful. So he is like the opposite of Fagin. And, he's actually, because he's so cringing and because he's so deferential and so meek and so mild, he's sort of like, I would say, like the Uncle Tom idea, as it has been taken up from that novel, and how people, oh, that person's an Uncle Tom. They just sort of, they crawl in front of, the white man. Here, he's kind of that image right there. No exaggeration. He is literally humble and crawling in front of his employer. So no, don't like Fagin, don't like Mr. Rhea. I like a lot of Dickens. These are not my favorites. Okay, another one comes earlier, and this is actually a woman who is very famous. Maria Edgeworth is one of the very few women novelists writing in her own name, although her father was listed as a co-writer. She's Irish. And she also wrote a couple of novels where the Jewish character is not good. Now, she's a best-selling novelist, late 18th century, early 19th century, just best-selling. One of her best-selling novels was a novel called Castle Rack Rent, where the owner of the castle, the nobleman, marries a Jewish woman. She's trapped in a loveless marriage, but she is no prize. And she also writes a more stereotypical kind of taboo Jew character, more evil. And so she gets a letter. And the letter is from a woman by the name of Rachel Mordecai, who lives in Charleston, South Carolina, in the United States, is living there in 1815, who has an incredibly interesting backstory of her own. Anyone who's ever been to the American Jewish History Museum in Philadelphia, she actually has been kind of highlighted in some of their permanent collections. And she writes this to the author living in Britain. Relying on the good sense and candor of Miss Edgeworth, I would ask, how can it be that she, who on all other subjects shows such justice and liberality, should on one alone appear biased by prejudice, should even instill that prejudice in the minds of youth? Can my illusion be mistaken? And she says, it is to the species of character which, wherever a Jew is introduced, is invariably attached to him. Can it be believed that this race of men are by nature mean, avaricious, and unprincipled? Forbid it, mercy. Yet this is more than insinuated by the stigma usually affixed to the name. So she's saying, this is awful. I love your novels, but you're continually saying that all Jews are avaricious, unprincipled, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Maria Edgeworth also takes this to heart and decides to change her tune and give us a good Jew, okay? Unlike Mr. Rhea, he's actually interesting. So she publishes a novel called Harrington, and this was published in 1817. And she actually, in the preface itself, the father mentions that this was because of a Jewish lady that this novel was written, a Jewish lady complaining of the illiberality with which the Jewish nation has been treated in some of Miss Edgeworth's works. I'm sorry. So this is absolutely in response to that letter. And this is the description of Mr. Montanaro. Mr. Montanaro is actually based on Moses Mendelssohn, who was this remarkable guy who went from the ghettos of Germany to become a noted philosopher. And this is the description. He is looking like a Sephardic Jew, which is considered to be higher level, the dark, thin, cultured. They know a lot of languages. And my favorite one is that he's said to be very generous with money, which of course is the opposite, but at least he's interesting. He's also too good to be true Jew, but he's interesting. He has a daughter, Berenice, who ends up marrying the Christian protagonist, Harrington. And you would say, wow, an interreligious marriage, how is that? And it turns out that this beautiful Jewess is not a Jew at all. That Mr. Montanaro ended up marrying a Christian, who he raised the daughter Christian, but they kept this information to Harrington, from Harrington, the Christian who is the protagonist of the novel, in order to see whether he would be willing to marry Berenice if she was not a Christian, and he was. And so they then revealed him, oh, but she's Christian after all. So it's important to note that that line is not broken, okay? So either a Christian has to marry a woman who is converted to Christianity, okay, a Jewish woman of Jewish origin, or they can't marry at all, as in Ivanhoe. So has the same taboo as interracial marriage had in the United States, and still has, sadly, in some places, that cannot be broken. You have to be in the same grouping. Okay, William Thackeray, one of my very, very favorite authors of all time, if not my favorite author completely. And he does parvenu Jews better than anybody else. He does the Jews on the make. And in Vanity Fair, that's one of his very famous novels, maybe the famous novel. The Newcombes is a novel a lot of people don't know about. It is also enormous. It is fabulous. So if you haven't read the Newcombes and you like Vanity Fair, you'll love the Newcombes. And at this point, we're talking around the 1850, Jews were entering the middle class through pursuits in the arts, teaching, dancing, or music, money-related profession, especially debtors' houses. When somebody was in debt, usually what they did before trial is that they incarcerated them as what's called debtors' houses. And if you paid bail, you could get out of that and wait until trial. But a lot of people, because they were debtors, they didn't have that. So they begin their life, their imprisoned life, in what's called debtors' houses. A lot of Jews actually did run these debtors' houses. Again, it was a profession not restricted to them, not requiring the education that they were denied in the higher levels of like Oxford and Cambridge and so forth. And it was a stepping stone. It was a middle class life. Same thing, opening gambling halls. So the Jews were very much into sort of what we might call sort of the entertainment, pawnbroking places. What's interesting is that we loved to write about these places. He loved to write about the music hall. He loved to write about sort of that lower middle class lifestyle. So he's encountering Jews all the time in his writing, in his nonfiction writing. It's just, these are the people he hangs with. And his Jews are not hard to figure out. Their names are Moses, Samuel, Aminadab, that is a biblical name. He will find names. And so you don't have to guess. He also describes them as Hebrews. He's very clear that they are in many ways overdressed or very gaudily dressed. But the important thing to know about Trollope is that, Thackeray, is that he is an equal opportunity satirist, okay? He makes fun of everybody. And that is probably why I like him. I'm going to talk a little bit more. Let me go into some of these images, okay? One is an image that was done in the early 1900s. When you got cigarettes, you could get cards of famous literary figures. This is Mr. Moss from the Newcombs. And again, notice that he is clearly Jewish in his physiology, but this isn't a bad picture. He has the showy tie pin, the jewel tie pin. Mr. Moss is actually somebody who the protagonist Newcomb actually meets when they're both going to art school. Mr. Moss likes to, make money. Thackeray is very clear about this, but Mr. Moss also loves the theater, loves being involved in that kind of lifestyle. He's sort of stereotypical, but he's really not a bad guy. Like he's like a scamp in a way. And so, this is not the worst image that we've had. He's a far cry from Fagin. This is an illustration of Miss Swartz from Vanity Fair. And anybody who's read Vanity Fair might recognize her. This is, again, utilizing actually two prejudicial tropes. She is said to be a woman from the islands, from the Caribbean, with an inheritor of a fortune. And interesting, she's supposed to be the offspring of a mulatto woman, that is a woman who is at least partly Black, and a German Jew. And of course, Thackeray didn't draw this, but this does relate to his rather unflattering descriptions of her. But she is a nice woman. And what's interesting is how many people who sort of despise her are going after her just because of her millions. And those are the ones he tends to despise a lot more than the woman herself, who was really quite kindly, a nice girl, basically, who is stuck in this untenable position. So yes, while the physical features are caricatured, not the heart. The middle one is a picture of a Jew talking to a Christian. And what you don't see in here is something called, this is actually called the Jew's Bill. It's for Jewish full emancipation, that is, Jews having all the same rights as Christians. And what's interesting is that Thackeray actually supported that. He actually was absolutely for Jews gaining equality with Christians. He came out and said so. In fact, he wrote a lot of different treatments, and one of them is something called On Clerical Snobs. He actually kind of invented our modern use of the term snob. And he said, yeah, look at all of these religious people. And he says, look at the church. He says, it thought itself justified in roasting a man for his religion, or pulling a Jew's teeth out if he did not pay a contribution, or ordered him to dress in a yellow gabardine and locked him in a particular quarter. So he is pointing out the hypocrisy of supposedly Christian clerics doing this to the Jews. And you're not going to find too many people willing to say that. So I got to hand it to him. He's in a way, he's like a latter day Voltaire. With the differences, Voltaire really didn't like Jews, and Thackeray was perfectly happy with Jews. He also said this in a short story called Captain Rook and Mr. Pigeon. And he said, there is no cheat like an English cheat, and that England produces them in the greatest number as of the greatest excellence. This is directly going against the belief that Jews were the cheats and the good English would never do that. And he points out, impoverished aristocrats and people who you would think, because they're blue blood, they would never dirty their hands, they were the worst cheats. And, you got to hand it to him. Maybe that's a stereotype too, but it does very effectively counter the other stereotypes that were out there. So my hat's off to Thackeray. He is one of my favorite authors. Okay, Jewish parvenus in the realm of Bernie Madoffs, okay? The idea is that, again, if a Jew made a lot of money in the stock market, there had to be something wrong. This was also the time of all kinds of bubbles, okay? We have had our bubbles, they had their bubbles, let's invest in this company. It turns out to be a fraud. Bernie Madoff is a great example of a Jewish person who, by the way, mostly defrauded other Jews, thank you, Bernie, of creating, these false, the expectations of high returns, creating this kind of Ponzi scheme, and then, cashing out with whatever they had and leaving a whole lot of investors in the lurch. Now, this image, and there was actually, I think, one case of, there are lots of cases of these kinds of Ponzi schemes, but one case that was associated with the Jewish a Jewish person who actually led it in 19th century Britain. So we have these. The Semi-Detached House is actually a novel that we read in the Victorian Book Club by Emily Eden, and it had Baron and Baroness Sampson. And oh boy, yes, Baroness Sampson was a great example of the parvenu Jewess. She wore too many clothes. She acted really snobbish. She was only interested, she was a sort of a woman on the make. So yes, her husband was knighted, but she was always out for the best chance. She overdressed. She was overweight. She was nasty. And that reminds us of the woman in the bathing suit that we saw, that image earlier. The Way We Live Now is a much more subtle depiction of this. And Melmoth is actually he never actually says that Melmoth's Jewish. And I find that fascinating. He intimates that he's Jewish, he suggests that he's Jewish, but Anthony Trollope never goes there. And part of the reason is that I think that he saw what is happening. He's, again, writing in the later part of the 19th century. He sees that it is not fashionable to negate Jews. And so he leaves it up in the air to some extent. That he has a strong accent, that he's dark, that no one knows his origins, that there are rumors about him. The fact that he is married to what Trollope calls, to a person Trollope calls a fat and fair Jewess, and that she is known because she's fat and her eyes are too close together. Yeah. And that his daughter Marie is actually not her daughter. So why is that important? Because Marie actually becomes a kind of a heroine in the story. She resists her father's corruption. She ends up marrying a non-Jew, and she is courted by a couple of the non-Jewish protagonists in the story. So if Melmoth's not Jewish, maybe not, then Marie may not be. And so she is the good Jewess. She's the beautiful Jewess versus maybe kind of a Shylock figure in Melmoth. So it's interesting. He does this with a lot of his Jewish characters, Trollope. He does this with a pastor, Mr. Emilius, who he basically is suggesting he's a Jew who became a Christian clergyman just for profit. But again, he's very careful to suggest and not come down on this. And I do think it's the time that he's writing. So these are images, and I wanted to show you these because they were very cool. So these are drawings that were done at the time, and then we have more modern images. Here we have an image of Melmoth, and he's a very powerful image. Does he look like a stereotypical Jew the way we've seen some of the other caricatures? Absolutely not. It is interesting. And so it leaves us still, he could be Jewish, he might not be Jewish. He is that enigmatic figure. Now, the idea that Jews somehow might be slipping willy-nilly into British society, that's interesting too. So maybe this is seen as more of a threat. It is easier to be careful of the Jews you know than the Jews you don't know. And this is the beautiful Jewess, his daughter Maria. These are images from a wonderful treatment of this done, I think, right in 2000 with David Suchet as Melmoth. And I got to tell you, I loved this, partly because David Suchet was, of course, Jewish, but he brought such a fun take on this. And it was pretty faithful to the book. So this is my shout out. If you look at The Way We Live Now, and you look it up in your various media accounts, you will find this series, and it's a high recommend. Okay. Last but not least, Daniel Deronda. Daniel Deronda is George Eliot's last book, George Eliot being Mary Ann Evans, written in 1876. And so again, a later treatment of Jews and Judaism, but this is an astonishing book on a number of different levels. First of all, it's a Zionist book. Now, she's writing this in 1876. Let me tell you, much of Zionist organizing and activity happened later than this. It happened in the 1880s, 1890s. This was almost an unheard of idea, even in the Jewish community at that time. Not completely, there were some forerunners, but very, very, very early. The idea is her Jewish hero, as this little cartoon suggests, longs for a rebirth of the Jewish nation in the land of Israel. And interestingly enough, major Zionist figures point out the effect this book had on them. Theodor Herzl, who was very famous for really trying to make the dream of Zionism into a political reality, and later than this book was written, was seen reading this book before the first Zionist Congress. Eliezer ben Yehuda reinvented Hebrew as a living language. It had only been a written language for a very long time. It wasn't a spoken language, an everyday spoken language. After reading the novel, Chaim Weitzman, again, a Zionist pioneer, early advocate of Zionism, his assistant Nahum Sokolow said, Duranda, the novel, paved the way for Zionism. So just a little bit about Mary Ann Evans. She was a biblical scholar. She was personally an atheist. It created problems with her and her religious father. She ended up not marrying, but living as a married woman with a man who was Catholic, who could not divorce his wife. She was unconventional in every way and brilliant in every way. Okay, so in Daniel Deronda, this is kind of two novels mushed into one. A lot of people have commented on this, but there is a Jewish side of the novel. And you have almost every kind of Jew there was in the stereotypes, and all humanized, all as Melmoth is, some of the other humanization happens with some of the other characters, with Thackeray. You see a real roundedness in George Eliot, probably the most out of all the authors I've been discussing. Mira Lapidote is a beautiful Jewess, okay? Mr. Lapidote, her father was the taboo Jew. He was a cruel man who forced her on the stage and tried to pimp her out, try to have her marry for money. He was a bad, bad Jew. So again, you have bad Jew, beautiful Jewess daughter. Leonora was also a beautiful Jewess. She ends up as the mother of Daniel Deronda. Daniel Deronda is really the hero of the story. He's a man who does not know his origins, this is the spoiler alert, discover that he's Jewish, and decides to throw his lot in with the Jewish people. And Leonora was his mother, an Italian Jew who went on the stage. Her father, his grandfather, Daniel Harisi, was Leonora's father, who was cruel and just wanted her to live according to Jewish law. He's the taboo Jew. So you have these weird echoes throughout the story, right? You had the pairing of the bad Jewish father, the evil or the too strict or the bad Jewish father with the beautiful Jewess. Twice. It echoes twice. That to me was very interesting. You also have the Parvenu Jews, Ezra Cohen and family, who were middle class, who were pawnbrokers. And again, if I had time, I could read you some quotes, but again, they're described with German Jewish features. The little one is praised because he wants to swap knives with Daniel Deronda and he wants to make a profit. The little girl is described as having Jewish features. They're described as, the mother of the family is described as someone who didn't bathe very much, wore a lot of jewelry, probably wore it to bed, but they were all still very nice, very humane people. So that's the ambivalence right there in her description of this family. But there's new variations on a theme. I'm telling you, there's more Jews in this book than you'll probably find in all of Victorian literature. You have Herr Klezmer, who is a Jewish man by birth, but who only cares about art. He's a musician. Now, he's unusual because he ends up marrying a woman of the nobility, and she's Christian, and he doesn't turn Christian. They marry because music is their people. It's their language. It's their ethnicity, the arts. So somehow that transcends the Jewish-Christian divide. And this is as taboo as you can imagine an interracial marriage would have been in a novel in the 1870s or 1880s in the US. Daniel Deronda, he's our wandering Jew. He's our guy who doesn't know where he belongs. And then he finally finds his homeland and his people. And we have Ezra Mordechai Cohen, a man dying of consumption who wants Daniel Deronda to take his vision of the Jewish people back in their homeland, living a normal, life, a life where they can really not try to be like the British or the French or anybody else, but can be like themselves, can rediscover their ancestral their ancestral beauties and passions and ways of living. And he's a Christ figure because he's dying and he's trying to give this, he's trying to create salvation for the Jews following him. And this is just one speech from this guy, Mordechai, who, by the way, turns out to be Mira Lapidot's brother. So it ends up being sort of all in the family. Daniel ends up marrying Mira. So there's a whole bunch of interconnections here. I'm not even going to talk about the Christian side of this novel. But Mordechai says, there is a degradation deep down below the memory that has withered into superstition. In the multitudes of the ignorant on 3 continents who observe our rites and make the confession of the divine unity, that's the Shema, the prayer of the Shema, which says God is one, a Hebrew prayer. The soul of Judaism is not dead. Revive the organic center. Let the unity of Israel, which has made the growth and form of its religion to be an outward reality. Looking towards a land and a polity, our dispersed people in all the ends of the earth may share the dignity of a national life, which has a voice among the peoples of the East and of the West, which will plant the wisdom and skill of our race, that it may be, as of old, a medium of transmission and understanding. That, kind of in a nutshell, is exactly what the early Zionist movement was also saying. So bravo for George Eliot, who somehow managed to precede so many others within the Jewish community in kind of conceptualizing this and even broadcasting it. Now, Daniel Deronda finds his place in this vision. I shall call myself a Jew, said Deronda deliberately, becoming slightly paler under the piercing eyes of his questioner. That's Mordechai. I'm sorry, no, it may not be Mordechai. I'll continue. But I will not say that I profess to believe exactly as my fathers have believed. Our fathers themselves changed the horizon of their belief and learned of other races. But I think I can maintain my grandfather's notion of separateness, the grandfather who didn't want his daughter going on stage, the grandfather who's kind of the mean, strict Jew, with communication. So he's saying there can be separateness. You can recognize a national identity, but you can also be happy to share in the world with others rather than be completely apart. I hold that my first duty is to my own people, and if there is anything to be done towards restoring or perfecting their common life, I shall make that my vocation. And finally, I just wanted to give a shout out for Israel Zangwill. If you want to know how Jews lived in Victorian Britain, he wrote quite a bit, but this is actually a great novel called Children of the Ghetto. And it is really one of my favorite novels. It was written very late in the Victorian era. It was written in 1792, and it was really written about this huge influx of Jews that came more from Eastern Europe in the late 1800s, but it's a fabulous novel. And in fact, we read a mystery written by him, very early mystery, in the Victorian Book Club. So I wanted to give Israel a shout out back again and say that. And this novel is absolutely worth reading if we're talking about Victorian literature. It is the first novel about Jews in Britain written by an Anglo-Jewish author. Okay, I've talked long enough, probably well over time. I'm sorry I got interrupted. And so I guess I'm ready for questions. So let me escape this and stop share and bring myself back. Comments, questions, thoughts, if you want me to read any quotes that I find too. Oh my God, you have 4 minutes for questions. This is not good. Sorry about that.
There's a comment in the chat box by Beth. I once read a quote by Dickens. Dickens claimed he was not anti-Semitic, just that every person he ever met who engaged in work similar to Fagin was a Jew. So that's, anybody else have anything? Feel free to unmute yourself or put something in the chat.
Yeah, it's Kathleen. I had to turn my video off because my internet. I've been reading some books from early 20th century, and this continued into the early 20th century. The Jew is other, and they're the Dr. Thorndike books, he was a scientific detective at that point. And the man who wrote them was a eugenicist, so that's part of it. But he talked about things like a Jew of the blonde type. And they were always in the financials. So it's interesting, it didn't change much. Granted, we're not much past the Victorian era, but it continued on.
So I will talk about that very briefly. It was only after World War II
Yep.
that a lot of this became gauche. And part of that was really the breakdown of the class structure also. I mean, that started after World War I, but you have to remember race theory was alive and well in the 20s and 30s too.
Oh, yeah.
So the anxiety about the British had about their upper classes being permeated, well, between the Holocaust and after World War II, their upper classes were, I mean, it was really much more of a wealth-based economy. So a lot of that left. And then, like I said, it was really, you know, I mean, after the Holocaust, it was very, in the United States too, it was considered to be bad form, to be that openly, you know, to point out people by their ethnicity in that way. You see this in Edith Wharton in some of her novels, the Jewish characters, because she was an upper crust New York society. They had the same towards some Jews, and she actually continued that trope in at least one of her novels. But it's interesting because in the United States, where do we see this continuing is with the Black community, to some extent with the Asian community, the Latinx community, much more so than the Jewish community. For Jews in the United States, much more mobile. We didn't have an aristocratic class. It wasn't about that much about class anxieties, but of course the color line in the US.
Yeah.
So a lot of that stuff that we see in Britain, we see it in the US. We just see it with a different group of people or different group of people.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, the 20s and 30s, I mean, there were brown shirts in England in the 30s.
Yes.
The nice thing about that is that it didn't take hold.
Yeah.
And people, you know, there were lots of mockery of those people who tried to start Nazi movement in England.
Although
and it was considered to be very negative. It was not considered positively by a lot of people.
Yeah, and there were I was in England in the 1990s, I think it was, and just very quickly, we were in a cab with a Greek guy, and he was obviously a Greek immigrant, had an accident, and he spent the whole ride complaining about the immigrants in England. So you were getting Middle Eastern, African, Caribbean. Those were people he viewed as immigrants, not himself, which I just thought was amusing.
It's always the other. And they thought that Jews were really noticeable as the other, which I think is kind of interesting, because in our society, in the United States, we had a recognizable other that was different enough that Jews, the Irish, the ones who were others in Britain could become white here. And so it's a very interesting process of who is other, how do you identify the other, and how do you, caricature or stereotype the other.
Any other questions, comments? Naomi.
Carol, are there any Jews depicted that are socialist rabble rousers? Is that, I mean, especially maybe the later 19th century with stereotypes surrounding Marx or 48 or, I mean, I haven't really encountered it in Victorian literature, but I also don't know Victorian literature as well as you do. But that would be like the last stereotype that I've encountered in general about Jews, is the kind of talking about class anxieties, and especially anxieties about the landed class and the rise of capitalism. The last part of that is like the revolutionaries.
What's interesting to me is who is writing these novels, right? So the socialist communist piece comes across a lot more clearly in Jewish writing about Jewish England. I mean, there is the people, like the major writers are writing in a very different milieu. Okay. So maybe with somebody like a George Gissing or the very, very later, that era, the 1880s, 1890s, you begin to see a recognition of this, but in the time frame that I am talking about, the Jews that they encountered were mostly, right, the people trying to push their way into their circles, which they didn't care for, or sort of a mass of Jews in, their version of the Lower East Side, which they didn't know well enough to differentiate. But I would bet if you look anytime from, I guess, 1885 on through that 1902 time, you may begin to see more and more of it. Not in the novels that I have read and loved, but I would be interested in doing a little more research and getting back to you on that, because I think that that's fascinating.
Yeah, Nelson.
I have a quick question. Dracula is one of my favorite books. Was Dracula Jewish?
That is a book I haven't read, and maybe I will leave that open to people who have. I do suspect that anybody who was a bloodsucker, and given the blood libel, that it could have some connection, but I don't know enough well enough to answer that. I wish I did. Anybody else have some thoughts about that?
I've thought about it over the years because it is my favorite book. The way it's written and the way it's compiled, the whole thing. And obviously there's a religious theme to it. And obviously the crucifix is very important. And you sort of wonder, he's obviously out there. He's not part of society. And he does all these awful things. But if you read Dracula, he's the perfect man. He's physically attractive. He's very bright. He's extremely strong. He's influential. And he's an outsider. And so I sort of wonder, was he Jewish?
I think it's interesting
That's
that
fascinating.
you have been
Yeah.
thinking that for years, because I recently saw an article like that saying that at least one reviewer or scholar thinks that it expresses anti-immigration sentiment in England. And so by that virtue, he was likely to be Jewish. So the fact that you kind of noticed all these things over the years is really interesting.
The tropes are all there. I mean, and that's what I think is fascinating, right? He's not identified as Jewish, but he is this, this handsome man, preys on women, sucks blood, outsider, but he insinuates himself into society. That to me is like the ultimate Jew trope without being Jewish. It's like Melmoth. He's Jewish, but he's not Jewish. He creates harm in society, but you can't pin it on him. And that's a greater anxiety, right? That there's a reason that in Germany, they wanted Jews to wear, badges. And the reason is you couldn't tell, not physically. So that was, Nazi Germany, that was one of the first things they did, is they needed to make lists of people, and they needed to have people wearing identifying badges as they did in medieval times, because you otherwise couldn't tell. And that's the fear. That's the fear. There are Jews among you. Some of them are sucking blood. Be careful. So I do not doubt, as you were both of you were talking, that it's using that kind of symbolism. Whether what Bram Stoker had in his mind, I can't answer.
So we probably have time for just one more quick comment or question. Okay, well, Carol, thank you so much. I thought it